Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will be meeting for the second time on February 27th and 28th, this time in Vietnam. Will the two leaders, who have openly praised one another in recent months, be able to conjure up meaningful results? For that, we have with us James Kim, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sang-mi.
On February 5th, President Donald Trump announced during his State of the Union address that he will meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for a second time. This summit is set to be on February 27th and the 28th in Vietnam.
Much work remains to be done, but my relationship with Kim Jong-un is a good one. Chairman Kim and I will meet again on February 27th and 28th in Vietnam.
This marks the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim in 260 days following their first historic meeting in Singapore on June 12 last year. Vietnam has emerged as a model country that ended its long years of hostility with the U.S. and became a partner of mutual development and prosperity. North Korea also regards Vietnam as a success story that managed to lift strong international sanctions and achieve economic development. Both North Korea and the U.S. are faced with serious challenges of nailing down some concrete denuclearization measures beyond the Singapore Joint Declaration. Many around the world are closely following whether or not the two leaders, who have been exchanging friendly letters, would actually succeed in achieving deals that would truly lead to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. With many in U.S. political circles voicing skepticism and concerns regarding North Korea's sincerity towards denuclearization and easing of sanctions, reaping tangible results from the second round of talks are deemed crucial. Accordingly, the world is closely following the developments between U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Stephen Biegun and his North Korean counterpart Kim Hyuk-chul as they coordinate the agenda and last-minute details with less than 3 weeks left until the second summit in Vietnam. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we discuss the significance and the implications of the second Kim-Trump summit, as well as some concerns and expectations that are being brought up within the United States.
So it's been 260 days since the two leaders met in Singapore, and now they're meeting again for the second time in Vietnam this time. But it still took some time until they got to decide on this meeting. So what is the significance of this meeting for both of them?
I think it's very important for both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump to get some kind of substantive result and deliverables from this meeting. For Kim Jong-un, he wants something more than what he was able to get after the Singapore talks. President Trump wants to probably hammer out a better deal than the one he had in Singapore. So both men are going into this with higher expectations about where they'll be at the end of this talk than where they were back in June of last year.
And let's talk about the venue. Vietnam. At the State of the Union, President Trump said that this meeting is going to take place in Vietnam, but Vietnam has painful history with the United States. But for North Korea, it is actually a model for prosperity and economic development. So why Vietnam?
So I think you laid out some of the symbolic meanings and the context surrounding this particular venue. Compared to Singapore, it's a different kind of venue. It is a communist state that has been able to achieve open market reforms. But obviously, talk of any kind of economic reforms or economic development in North Korea is a taboo. It can't be framed in that way, but Vietnam, in terms of what it's been able to accomplish, I think it sets an example for North Korea to consider some possibilities about what it might do in the years ahead if an agreement is reached. For the United States, there's also a historical context of some conflict, but they've been able to get over that. And the bilateral relations between the U.S. and Vietnam is actually quite good currently. So there's a sort of a contextual and a symbolic significance of this location. But most importantly, it's a neutral location for both countries. And there aren't many countries that you can point out that's close to North Korea, within travel, within the distance that Kim Jong-un can travel to, where both men would be comfortable. North Korea has diplomatic ties to Vietnam. It has an embassy there. There's a strong party-to-party tie with the communist parties in each respective countries. Overall, I think it makes for a very ideal location, but one of a few countries where we could say that North Korea would be comfortable meeting with their counterparts from the United States.
Exactly, especially it'll be easier for Kim Jong-un to get there because the distance is a lot closer than in Singapore, right?
It's certainly closer than some of the other locations that's been floated out there, namely in Europe. He would need to borrow a charter flight, likely from China, and he would have to have stopovers in order to get there. Under the current situation with what they have, I think the most ideal location is somewhere in Southeast Asia. And so Vietnam was floated as a potential candidate for the first summit, but I think it's a very good location given where they've held it in Singapore last June.
Right, but going back a few days, there was the State of the Union by President Trump. But during that time, Stephen Biegun, the U.S. representative for North Korea, he actually flew over to North Korea to meet his counterpart and have working level talks. So given these diplomatic moves that we see, do you think that some real discussions are actually taking place behind the scenes?
From what we know, based on certain reports coming out of both the State Department and elsewhere, there have been significant changes in North Korean behavior since the last working level visit by Steve Biegun in Seoul. I believe it was last month. Since that, actually towards the end of December rather. And I think that since that time there have been a lot of activity involving bilateral ties and discussions between the United States and North Korea. As you know, Kim Hyuk-chul and Kim Hyuk-chul visited Washington, D.C. last month. We've also had bilateral talks between Choi Sun-hee and Steve Biegun in Stockholm. So there have been a lot of activities, along with Kim Jong-un visiting Beijing and holding a summit with Xi Jinping. In many ways, I think there have been a short lull holding period towards the November and December of last year. And after the New Year speech by Kim Jong-un, I think things are now moving again very quickly. And it seems North Korea is now ready to negotiate, whereas they've been kind of planning for this moment for much of the end of last year.
Right, we'll come back to our analysis after we connect to other experts. We now connect to an expert in Washington, D.C. for more details. Joining me now is Andrew Yeo, an associate professor of politics, also director of Asian Studies at Catholic University of America. Thank you for being here, Professor.
Okay, good to see you here this morning.
The date and the venue of the second Kim-Trump summit has been confirmed. How high are the expectations for this summit within the U.S.?
They're pretty high because this has been in the news cycle since October. Since November, that there's going to be a high-level meeting between Trump and Kim. So I think the expectations are pretty high. This may be the one foreign policy victory that Donald Trump gets. So the expectations are pretty high.
What is the reason behind the Trump administration adopting a step-by-step plan on approaching North Korea? And do you think this swerve would actually have a positive impact for the ultimate goal of denuclearization?
Well, the Trump administration hasn't always thought about phased negotiations. Remember, they wanted the North Koreans to denuclearize right away. John Bolton had said that it can be done in 1 year. I think they've walked back that now, realizing that that's not going to get them anywhere. So now they are taking this stepwise approach, which is what the Chinese and North Koreans have been calling for. But we don't know what the end goal will be, but this is the only way I think that the process can move forward step by step, through the step-by-step process, where the North Koreans give some concessions, the United States gives a few concessions.
Professor Ye, do you think the upcoming summit in Vietnam in the end of February will yield better results than the summit in Singapore? And what are the preconditions for this summit to be successful?
That's certainly the hope that both sides can move the ball further than the Singapore summit. The Singapore summit, the bar was so low in terms of what was accomplished that I don't think you can get any lower than that. So by that fact alone, I think we're going to get more results. But both Kim and Trump are under pressure to deliver something. We can't just have another Singapore type summit where it's just a getting to know you and meet. There has to be concrete steps. I think for the United States, I think one important step is providing a list or a site of the nuclear sites, some sort of accounting for it. And also, I think the North Koreans need to agree to some degree that there's going to be verification and inspection. So the list, and the North Koreans have offered to destroy the Pyeongyang complex. There are also some missile sites that I think the U.S. would want the North Koreans to declare. I don't think this would be that difficult because the U.S. already knows that some of these missile sites exist, and the North Koreans know that the Americans know, so there wouldn't be any new information. But I think just in terms of, I don't want to call it, it's more than symbolic, but you have to show something diplomatically for it. So I think that's on the North Korean side. I think for the United States, for them it would be removing or relieving some of the sanctions pressure that's been on North Korea. I think that's the first thing that the North Koreans would like. I don't expect the U.S. to give too much on the sanctions ground, but at the very least, perhaps they can release some of the sanctions that relate to inter-Korea cooperation. So that might be some of the things that are brought up in terms of what can North Korea and the U.S. give regarding concessions.
Thank you. That was Professor Andrew Ye, an expert in South Korea-U.S. alliance and North Korea. We go straight to another expert in Washington, D.C. Joining us now is Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at Brookings Institution. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
President Trump, during his second State of the Union, did not take up much time to talk about North Korea. It seems a bit worrisome, but ahead of the second Kim-Trump summit, what are some of the concerns that are being raised in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I don't worry myself that President Trump only mentioned Korea fairly briefly. For one thing, these State of the Union speeches have gotten to be extremely long in American politics, and I wish they were shorter. And I don't feel the president should be obliged to cover every issue. I think it would actually be better if the speeches were much shorter and more thematic rather than comprehensive. But that's more a question for American politics than for Korean audiences. I'm not worried because any issue where the president's going to fly halfway around the world and take 4 days out of his schedule when you count travel, that's a pretty big priority. And so I think we should be encouraged that President Trump is devoting such energy to this. And even though I am not a supporter of President Trump and generally do not agree with his policies, I think there is the possibility of substantial progress on the U.S.-North Korea and ROK North Korea relationships and the nuclear issue. The key question in Vietnam is going to be, can we consider some kind of a compromise, some kind of an interim deal that does not immediately envision complete disarmament of North Korea, complete nuclear disarmament. I think that's unrealistic. And if the United States holds to that position, I do not believe we'll see any meaningful progress. But if there is a way, for example, to explore the North Korean willingness to dismantle its uranium enrichment and plutonium production capability in exchange for a partial relief of sanctions, that kind of idea could be very appealing.
You just mentioned about the dismantlement of the uranium and plutonium enrichment facilities. So what more can the U.S. demand from North Korea from this summit? Also, do you think U.S. would see North Korea's dismantlement of ICBM a serious commitment to ensuring U.S. security?
Well, first of all, I think the nuclear issue is even more important than the ICBM issue, although they're both important. And certainly for Korean friends, the ICBM issue is secondary to the question of short-range and medium-range missiles. And that's true, of course, for Japanese friends as well. So I think the real core issue here is indeed the nuclear weapons. And so the production capability for those would be my top priority. Certainly, we need to see a continuation of the moratorium on nuclear and missile testing. I think that goes without saying, and that should be codified into a lasting commitment as well. And then I would like to see dismantlement of ICBM production capability, but I'd be a little more flexible on that point. I would also like to see an elimination of the chemical weapons stocks of North Korea, because if we're going to have a deal in which North Korea keeps many of its nuclear warheads for the foreseeable future, then I think we're essentially acknowledging North Korea's need for an ultimate deterrent of some kind. And if it keeps those warheads for the foreseeable future, I don't understand why it would need chemical weapons or biological weapons. These are all equally illegitimate under international law. And so I would like to see some consideration of that question as well. And I think the United States and South Korea should be willing to agree to some kind of a declaration of a state of non-hostilities. We can call it a peace treaty or not, doesn't really matter. I think formalizing the fact that we're not at war is perfectly reasonable. And so if we can add that in as a sweetener for North Korea, I think that's a good idea too. And then some of the sanctions, especially the UN sanctions that have been imposed in the last 2 to 3 years, I think those could be relaxed, suspended, and then ultimately lifted as part of this deal. We could still keep American sanctions as a way to maintain the principle that we're not going to fully deal with a nuclear North Korea, and until it eliminates all of its warheads at some future date, some future deal, there have to be ongoing sanctions and restrictions on American engagement, and perhaps World Bank and other international development body engagement with North Korea. But I think we could lift the sanctions that have prevented South Korea, China, Russia, other regional countries from having good bilateral economic relationships with North Korea as part of this interim compromise deal.
Some are concerned that President Trump will raise the issue of pulling the troops or reducing the U.S. troops in South Korea during this summit.
Well, I think the U.S.-ROK alliance is crucial. I would like to see it last even after an end to the state of hostilities between North and South Korea. I would like to see it last even if there is a reunified Korea. But of course, that's a choice for both countries, and we're not really there yet. We should be thinking about it, however, in case the idea comes up in negotiations, because, of course, some people would ask, if the North Koreans would agree to complete denuclearization, why do we still need a U.S.-ROK alliance? I would simply observe that we had the alliance before North Korea even had its nuclear capability, and I think the alliance can be transformed to be a pillar of regional multilateral stability over time. And I think the alliance actually helps both the United States and South Korea essentially create a more stable structure in international politics in Northeast Asia. We know that South Korea is a relatively small country surrounded by a lot of big countries, and it may welcome an ongoing relationship with the United States. And I think for the United States, we see South Korea as one of our best allies, now one of our most powerful and wealthiest allies as well. And so it makes sense to try to preserve that relationship indefinitely. But I think the important thing is in the short term, we certainly need to maintain deterrence, and we don't want to see North Korea somehow try to end the alliance and thereby weaken South Korea's own security or make South Korea vulnerable to coercion or brinkmanship out of some kind of a misplaced deal. So I don't believe the alliance should be on the table at all in these negotiations.
Thank you very much. That was Michael Hanlon, a defense strategy expert in the U.S. James, what do you think about the analysis of your two colleagues, especially they mentioned about the interim deal between the two countries. What do you think about that?
I think given what we've seen since the Singapore summit, the pace at which we're moving in this transition towards complete denuclearization is a relatively slow and very, very slow process. And so I think we need to temper the expectation a bit. We can't completely say that we will have everything that we wanted from this second summit. In fact, a lot of people talked about some of the things that were mentioned by both Michael and Andrew from the first summit. From the U.S. side, they wanted a declaration of all the fissile materials as well as the weapons. There was a discussion in Washington about a roadmap for denuclearization where North Korea will take concrete steps in dismantling some of these sites and how they will allow for verification and inspection of these sites. versus North Korean demands from a stepwise point of view towards normalized diplomatic relations, as well as resumption of humanitarian assistance and food aid, along with complete sanctions relief. Obviously, we're not even close to any of these things. We expect to see something, maybe the expectation is a bit tempered after the Singapore summit, where we will have something a little bit less than a full roadmap, but some concrete deliverables that may include certain sites like Dongchangni Yeongbyon with international verification and inspection. And if North Korea is willing to provide any other information about other sites where they're enriching uraniums and producing plutonium, we can actually move forward with some of these other things that were mentioned by Michael. It really depends on where the working level meeting is at the current moment and whether Steve Biegun and his counterpart can come to some sort of an agreement about what kinds of things will be talked about at the next summit, and also what the two leaders will agree to. So it's really critical that the working level meeting is a productive one. If it isn't, we may end up with something a little bit lesser than that. We need to, I think, temper our expectations to an extent and think about this as a long game rather than something that is going to be achieved with just this, one summit, another summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump.
But it still seems that the U.S. has definitely retreated a little bit from their strong stance on this. Don't you think so? Especially the rhetorics. President Trump during his State of the Union actually said that if he wasn't elected president, that the U.S. might be in a war with North Korea.
I think U.S. wants to, ever since Steve Biegun was appointed to this role as a special representative for North Korea, and he is the point man for negotiating with North Korea on this issue, the U.S. has had a very practical and pragmatic approach on this issue, and they want to be seen, I think, as a faithful and just negotiating partner. They want to go into this looking like they're a fair negotiating partner. They don't want to come out of this looking like they're unreasonable. The question here is, how much can they get? Can they get complete denuclearization, or will it stop somewhere a little bit lesser than that? And I think it depends on the willingness on the part of North Korea, whether they are, in fact, they've made the decision to, they made the strategic decision to completely denuclearize, or they have not. And on the U.S. side, whether they're going to take the corresponding steps that North Korea is willing to accept. And so there has to be some degree of compromise from both sides to get to the promised land here. And at the moment, it's not clear how they're going to get there. But given the pace, I think it's going to be a very, very long process.
I see. And before I let you go, how about the reciprocal Seoul visit from Kim Jong-un that he had promised earlier? Do you think it's a possibility sometime in March?
I think anything is possible at this point. As long as they're talking, anything's certainly possible. The logistical details of that will have to be worked out by both sides. Clearly, Blue House has expressed an interest in doing this during the last Pyongyang summit. And I believe Kim Jong-un has also reciprocated by stating that he would like to do this. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if this, in fact, happens. But again, let's deal with these one step at a time. We've got the first summit. We need to have it happen at the end of this month, and we need concrete deliverables from that meeting. Without that, it's not clear to me whether even a Seoul visit, other than the symbolic significance that it will have, whether it will have any policy, any meaning in terms of policy. So I'll take this one step at a time for now.
Okay, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Sami.
The positive exchanges between the two leaders, as well as the internal and external pressures that they both face, has got international observers on their edge of their seats as they await the potential outcome from the Vietnam summit at the end of this month. That's all we have for The Point World Affairs this week. Thank you for tuning in, and see you again next week with more updates on the latest developments.